Good morning. Can you guys hear me all right? Oh, good. Well, it's a real privilege to be here. I come from Kelowna, British Columbia, so it's just a tiny bit colder there than it is here. Not that much, though, probably about pretty close to the same. But anyway, I am delighted to be with you. Thank you for coming out so early this morning. And many thanks to the people that came from so far away. I met two this morning, one from a couple from Australia and a couple from Germany, so that's pretty exciting. So my presentation this morning is, can we pause for a second? Was my time supposed to start at 1 hour and 30 minutes? Okay. So I'll say, I guess it's saying 1:13. I'm going, and I'm not going to get it done. My talk this morning is called Defeating Disease with a Whole Food Plant-Based Diet, What to Eat. And I've basically divided it into two parts. Part one, we'll be talking about diet and disease and really about the strength of the link and also why the plant-based advantage. And the second part is the what to eat part. And we'll talk about 10 steps to an optimal plant-based diet. So part one, diet and disease. This is what we know. We know that about 70% of the deaths in the developed world are due to chronic diseases of our own making. An estimated 90% of type 2 diabetes, 80 to 90% of heart disease, and 40 to 70% of cancers are considered entirely preventable. In 2011, the World Health Organization identified the 4 big lifestyle culprits, and they identified them as being a sedentary lifestyle, excessive alcohol, tobacco, and an unhealthy diet. And they identified the unhealthy diet as the number one risk factor. And they defined an unhealthy diet as one that is based on processed foods with added fat, sugar, and salt, and animal products rich in saturated fats. It's low in vegetables, fruits, legumes, whole grains, nuts, and other high fiber foods. And I want you to dissect this just a little bit. They really identify 2 categories of foods that are responsible for our epidemic of chronic disease. And those are number 1, processed foods with added fat, sugar, and salt. And number 2, animal products rich in saturated fats. Those they identify as the 2 big culprits. What do they say can help to prevent disease? Vegetables, fruits, legumes, whole grains, nuts, and seeds. Plant-based foods that are rich in fiber and phytochemicals and so on. At the highest risk are inactive populations consuming Western-style diets. The highest rates globally we find in North America, Northern Europe, Australia, and of course, the developing countries who are rapidly adopting our Western ways. And this is, we've probably all seen it, but it really is very sad to see because so many of these populations that lived off the land for so many generations very rapidly develop these diseases when they start eating the way that we're eating. At the lowest risk are populations who live simply, are physically active, and consume unprocessed plant-based diets. The lowest rates globally are some parts of rural Asia, parts of South America, and of course, the blue zones. And the blue zones, for those of you that are not familiar with the blue zones, these are places in the world where people live the longest, healthiest lives. They have more centenarians, people that live to be at least 100, than anywhere else in the world. But what's really interesting about these populations is not only do these people live a long time, but in the latter stages of their lives, they're still productive. Even at 90 or 100 years of age, they're still walking up the sides of the mountains and gardening. And that's what's really interesting about the blue zones. And there are 5 blue zones: Okinawa, Sardinia, Italy, Loma Linda, California, and that's the Seventh-day Adventists, the vegetarian Adventists, Icaria, Greece, and the Nicoya Peninsula of Costa Rica. And if you look at what common sort of thread can you weave through all of these long-lived, healthy populations, there are several. And the first is that they tend to have a very strong sense of family. They tend not to smoke. They're strongly socially engaged. They do constant moderate physical activity. So they're moving all day long. They're doing their gardening, they're walking, and so forth. And where diet is concerned, there are two big factors that are common to all blue zones. Number one, they all consume legumes or beans, lentils, peas, so forth, as part of their foundational foods. And two, they all consume plant-based diets, every single one. Not necessarily vegetarian or vegan, just the Adventists are vegetarian or vegan, but very strongly plant-based. And this man that you see standing here is an Okinawan centenarian. This man is 100 or more years of age. He was just identified as a centenarian. And just look at this man. He's got a shovel over his shoulders. Look at the definition of the muscles in the arm, in his arms, his veins. Is this not what we all want to look like when we're 100 years old? This is unbelievable. And look at his face. He's so cute. And the reality is we have really and truly mountains of evidence where plant-based diets are concerned, truckloads of evidence. And so we're just going to take a quick peek at some of the evidence I think is the most compelling. And that evidence comes from mainly two large cohorts. There's actually a third in Taiwan as well, which I'll mention briefly, but the two big cohorts, these are cohorts where the researchers have been following groups, populations that are very health conscious. These people exercise and they tend not to smoke and they live healthy lives. But within the cohorts, the people eat differently. And so what they've got is about a third of each cohort is either lacto-ovo-vegetarian or vegan, and they divide it up into meat eaters, fish eaters, which are fish eaters plus lacto-ovo, semi-vegetarians, vegetarians, and vegans. And so a third being either lacto-ovo-vegetarian or vegan. And the first is the Adventist Health Study 2 with over 96,000 participants. The study actually began in 2002 but is ongoing. And Epic Oxford from the UK, over 65,000 participants. And it began in 1993 and is ongoing. So what's really interesting to know about these cohorts is people in these health-conscious cohorts, regardless of the dietary group, whether they're meat eaters or vegans, they all die at about half the rate of the general populations in their regions as a cohort. So why you need to know this is because when we compare vegans in these cohorts with meat eaters, we're not comparing vegans with the general population that are eating a Western-style diet. We're comparing them with meat eaters who smoke the same amount, drink the same amount, exercise the same amount, have the same kind of education, are about the same age. So we're controlling for what we call confounding variables, but we're also comparing to similar health-conscious individuals. So the differences in heart disease and cancer and diabetes would be much smaller when you compare people that are so similar versus comparing with Western diet eaters. So just know that. So what are the findings? Well, where cardiovascular disease is concerned, compared again to similar health-conscious meat eaters, cardiovascular disease rates were 32% lower among lacto-ovo-vegetarians and vegans combined in Epic Oxford. And that was controlled for everything except body mass index or body fatness. But when body fatness was factored in, it was still 28% lower. The Adventist Health Study 2, cardiovascular disease was 42% lower among vegan men, 23% lower among lacto-ovo-vegetarian men. It was actually 34% lower among pesco-vegetarian men or fish eaters. But there were no significant differences in cardiovascular disease in women. And hypertension, in the Adventist Health Study 2, compared to similar health-conscious non-vegetarians, the risk of hypertension was 75% lower among vegans and 55% lower among lacto-ovo-vegetarians. Cancer, compared again to the similar health-conscious non-vegetarians or meat eaters, cancer rates were 19% lower among vegans and 11% lower among lacto-ovo-vegetarians. In the Adventist Health Study 2, they were 16% lower among vegans and 8% lower among lacto-ovo-vegetarians. Diabetes in the Adventist Health Study 2, the risk of developing diabetes was 62% lower among vegans and 38% lower among lacto-ovo-vegetarians, and that was even controlled for BMI. So it was controlled for all confounding variables. So even with body fatness factored in, vegans still had a 62% lower risk. And this is where I bring in the Taiwanese, because in the Taiwanese studies, and they're coming out with quite a few studies, they're actually looking at a Buddhist population where some Buddhists are meat eaters and some are vegetarians, and they're comparing similar health-conscious, Taiwanese Buddhists with the vegetarians versus the meat eaters. And in their diabetes study, they reported that the risk of developing diabetes was actually 51% lower among vegetarian and they're very near vegan men, and about 75% lower among vegetarian or near vegan women. Kidney disease, compared to similar health-conscious non-vegetarians, the vegetarians and vegans combined had 52% less kidney disease and 31% fewer kidney stones. So that was Epic Oxford. So very, very interesting, because a lot of people think, well, there's more oxalates in a vegan diet, they might get more kidney stones, and in fact, they get almost a third less. Cataracts in Epic Oxford, the vegans had 40% less cataracts, and the lacto-ovo-vegetarians had about 30% less cataracts than the non-vegetarians. And diverticular disease, again, Epic Oxford, the vegans had 72% less diverticular disease, and the lacto-ovo-vegetarians had 27% less diverticular disease. And so this is a very, very quick rundown of some of the evidence in terms of disease risk reduction. The evidence, really, if you look overall at the evidence, it is strong and highly consistent. And you do the searches yourself, and the amount of information is honestly overwhelming. But I think that the studies from Epic Oxford and the Adventist Health Study 2 are really among the most compelling. And people, I think almost all experts get this, and within the medical and dietetic communities, I think this is pretty well understood. But what is much less recognized is the power of plant-based diets in treating existing disease. And so I think we need to take a little bit of a look at that. So what we know in terms of heart disease reversal is that plant-based diets, as far as I understand, are the only diets that have been shown to actually reverse coronary heart disease. And the first studies we had were really from Dean Ornish, and if you remember 1990, the Lifestyle Heart Trial, and this was the study I thought would change the world and the way cardiologists practiced, and it didn't, which is shocking to me. But Dean Ornish took people who had such severe disease, they were told there was nothing more that could be done for them. They'd already had, the triple bypasses and everything else they could have. And so most of them were given a fairly short time to live. And 82% of his participants experienced reversal. The experimental group, and they compared, this sort of very low-fat vegetarian diet and exercise and stress management and so forth with a sort of conventional step one diet for cardiovascular disease. And the experimental group had 2.5 fewer events in the 5-year follow-up than the control group. I think Dean Ornish has gone on to do some other work, which we'll talk about later, but this was really quite revolutionary because we didn't think at that time that you could actually reverse or decrease the size of plaques in blood vessels. And so this proved we could reduce the size of plaques in blood vessels, and that was, to me, pretty earth-shattering. But what physicians always told me when I was giving talks was, well, that's all well and good, we believe it, but my patients would never do that. And my answer has always been and will always be, your responsibility as a physician is to lay the options out on the table. It's your patient's job to decide what they can or cannot or will not do. And at the very least, you have an obligation, a responsibility to lay the options out on the table, because you know what? Some people who you would never suspect might choose to eat a healthy diet as opposed to having their chest cut open and be on medications for the rest of their lives. So I think that's just the important point there. And Caldwell Esselstyn did a sort of similar study, but in his, he did not use the sort of exercise and stress management. It was really strictly diet. In some cases, he used statins, but 72% of the people in his cohort actually experienced reversal. And his follow-ups were even more positive than Dean Ornish's, because he literally had nobody who followed the program that had any kind of recurrence. So it was really quite astounding. But again, he used a very low-fat vegan diet. And Dean Ornish's wasn't completely vegan, but Dr. Esselstyn's was. And then in 2014, he had 198 patients, 177 that did the program and stuck to the program, 21 that were non-adherent. And the recurrence rate was 0.6% in adherent patients and 62% in non-adherent patients. 13 out of 21 people had an event. And this wasn't, it was a self-selected group. There wasn't a control. It wasn't randomized. It wasn't kind of the gold standard clinical study that we need. But it was still, the results were so compelling that it should tell us we need to do more studies on this. Cancer, well, cancer's hard because you can't just take a group of cancer patients and say we're going to randomize half of you to the gold standard of treatment and the other half will do this diet. It wouldn't pass any sort of ethical boards, so it's a little tougher. But we have preliminary evidence that shows that well-planned or well-designed plant-based diets inhibit cancer cell growth, reduce DNA damage, improve DNA repair, lower IGF-1 levels, favorably alter gut microflora, reduce levels of a variety of toxic metabolites, and just do a variety of things that make your body better able to deal with carcinogens. And we actually have some really interesting research from Dean Ornish on prostate cancer. And the reason this worked is because he took men with early stage prostate cancer who elected not to receive any treatment because they didn't really need it yet. He had 49 people in a control group and 44 people in the lifestyle intervention. He used the same kind of lifestyle intervention that he used with his cardiovascular disease patients. And after 1 year, 6 people in the control group they started conventional treatment because their disease had progressed to the extent that they felt that they needed treatment. Nobody in the lifestyle group started treatment. PSA dropped 4% in the lifestyle group and increased 6% in the control group. But what was most amazing to me was serum from the lifestyle group inhibited cancer cell growth almost 8 times more than serum from the control group. So this was quite interesting. And then in 2008, he released a study where I think it was about 30 men in this study, followed for about 3 months, put on a plant-based diet, and all the usual lab measures improved. But what was the most stunning about this study is genetic expression changed. Nearly 500 cancer promoter genes were downregulated, and nearly 50 cancer preventing genes were upregulated. And this was huge. We could actually change the expression of our genes by changing the food we put into our bodies. So very, very important research. And then in 2013, a 5-year follow-up, he actually reported on the telomere length. And this was just shocking because telomeres are the little things at the ends of our chromosomes that basically tell us how long we might live if we don't get hit by a truck, right? And so what normally happens is as you get older, they get smaller and smaller and smaller. But people who were adhering to this, sort of lifestyle change, their telomeres actually increased in size, where of course the control group, their telomeres got predictably shorter. So, and again, this was really quite a revelation. We did not know that we could actually increase the length of our telomeres by simply changing our lifestyle. What about diabetes? Well, treatment of diabetes, PCRM has done a number of small studies that have compared a vegan diet with a conventional diet. And both the low-fat vegan diet and the American Diabetic Association diet improved glycemic and blood lipid control, but the improvements were consistently greater for those consuming the vegan diets. In Europe, the Czech Republic, they did some studies comparing a near vegan diet. There was a serving of I think, low-fat yogurt per day. That was the only animal product. And they compared that to a conventional diabetes diet. And the people on the vegetarian diet had better, more improved insulin sensitivity, reduced medications, reduced visceral fat. They had reduced oxidative stress markers. They reduced their LDL cholesterol levels. So a number of positive changes. And then I want to just take a couple of minutes to tell you about the research that I've been involved with in the Marshall Islands. And the Marshall Islands have among the highest rates of diabetes in the world. 80 years ago, diabetes was pretty much unheard of in the Marshall Islands when people actually lived off the land. So they ate plants and, of course, the fish they could catch, and that was pretty much it. Now, the Marshall Islands, for those of you that don't know, are somewhere between, about halfway between Hawaii and Australia, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And there's nothing within 2,000 miles in any direction of the Marshall Islands. They're very, very isolated. And I went there in 2006 and was involved with a study looking at a very aggressive lifestyle intervention program compared to the usual care. We had 169 participants and 5 overlapping cohorts, so 5 different groups of people. And just to make a long story very short, fasting sugars dropped 71 points in the first 2 weeks of the program on average, and close to 50 points by 12 weeks. A1C dropped about 2 points by 12 weeks on average. HOMA-IR, which is a measure of insulin resistance, dropped almost, 2.5 to 3 points. CRP, which is a measure of inflammation, dropped 1.2 points, 12 weeks and stayed that way. So the really quite significant findings. Now, I go back pretty much every year and continue to do work there. And in 2014, we achieved an average blood glucose drop of 119 milligrams per deciliter, or 6.6 millimoles per liter, which is just absolutely stunning. We did an eBay in another little island called, another intervention in eBay, which is a little island that, just wrap your brain around this, it's 0.14 square miles with 15,000 people. So it's just absolutely packed with people. There is no room for growing produce. We brought in 170 earth boxes so that people could grow in these little boxes, but even that's hard to find space for. And we achieved an average glucose drop of about 50 milligrams per deciliter. We were back in 2016 doing an intervention for Bikini Island folks, which is the island that the atomic bomb testing was done after the Second World War. And the average fasting glucose drop we achieved there was 63 milligrams per deciliter. We had over 11 participants with drops of over 100 milligrams per deciliter. So, why the vegetarian advantage? Why do people eating plant-based do so much better? And the simple answer is whole food plant-based diets work because they address the root cause of disease. It's really that simple. So how do they work? Well, they essentially disable the drivers of chronic disease. And there are several, and we're going to talk about 4. Inflammation, oxidative stress, lipotoxicity, and dysbiosis. And inflammation is, what we know is, most people know inflammation when they get a cut and it turns red and puffy, but we can get this sort of chronic low-grade inflammation throughout the body, and it's a risk factor for almost every chronic disease you can think of, including the big ones, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and cancer. What inflammation does is it promotes the growth of plaque, weakening fibrous caps, which you'll hear about from Dr. Esselstyn a lot, and it basically increasing the risk of rupture of these fibrous plaques. It interferes with insulin signaling, and it increases insulin resistance. It promotes tumor growth and can trigger the loss of proteins involved in DNA repair. So what causes chronic inflammation? Well, overweight and abdominal obesity, especially when the fat is carried in and around the vital organs. This is what we call visceral fat, as compared to subcutaneous fat, which is at the surface of the skin. Processed Western-style diets, chronically elevated blood sugar causes inflammation. Extreme exercise, lack of sleep, smoking, alcohol, pollution, and stress are all things that can increase inflammation. So is there a plant-based advantage? Well, we had a systematic review and meta-analysis in 2017 that showed that vegetarian diets had a favorable impact on CRP levels, a measure of inflammation, in people that had been vegetarian for at least 2 years. And what they found was of 8 studies, 6 found significantly lower levels of CRP in vegetarians. 1 found very little difference, and 1 actually reported higher levels in the vegetarians. We only have 2 studies on vegans that I'm aware of. And 1 was done in 2017 in Brazil with 268 participants. The CRP levels in vegans were 0.5 milligrams per liter. Lacto-ovo-vegetarians, they were 0.8 milligrams per liter. Omnivores, 1.1 milligrams per liter. The second study was done in the United States in 2007. Only 63 participants, but interestingly, the CRP levels of vegans were almost the same as what was reported from the Brazil research group. And this was 0.52 milligrams per liter. They were compared to endurance athletes. Their CRPs were 0.75 milligrams per liter, and they were both compared to people eating a Western-style diet, and their CRPs were 2.61 milligrams per liter, so a lot higher than the omnivores in Brazil, a worse diet I would expect. Oxidative stress. Oxidative stress, what we know is it induces damage to proteins, DNA, cell membranes, and it increases the development, progression, and complications associated with chronic disease. So what causes oxidative stress? Well, it's very similar to what causes inflammation, but one of the main things is an insufficient supply of antioxidants from whole plant foods. Overeating, highly processed foods, chemical contaminants, products of high temperature cooking, alcohol, tobacco, stress, and air pollution. And basically, and radiation. So basically what we're looking at is all of those things are sort of pro-oxidants, if you will. And so there's an imbalance between the antioxidants and the pro-oxidants. And for those of you that don't really understand this whole antioxidant thing, oxidative stress is about free radicals in your body that are trying to steal electrons from other molecules because they're missing an electron. But when they do that, they turn whatever they stole the electron from into a free radical. And it starts this chain reaction of destruction in your body. Now, what an antioxidant does is it comes along and says, "Excuse me, free radical, would you like an electron?" And the free radical says, "Why? Thank you, yes." But so it donates an electron, but it doesn't turn into a free radical. So it remains stable. That's what an antioxidant is. So that's very helpful. And we need more antioxidants and fewer pro-oxidants. So is there a plant-based advantage in terms of oxidative stress? Well, I do your search on PubMed, and the list of studies is really extensive. I've got a few written down here. But the studies completely consistently demonstrate vegetarians, including vegans, have more favorable antioxidant status because they eat more fruits and vegetables and other antioxidant-rich foods. And that's the bottom line. This is something called lipotoxicity. This is another major driver of chronic disease. It's one that many people have never heard of. But it's one that you need to know about because it is hugely, hugely important. So most of us, or all of us, I should say, have this way of storing excess calories, and it's called our adipose tissue. We put anything that is consumed in excess of what our body needs gets stored as fat in adipose tissue. But when our body gets overwhelmed with trying to shuttle this stuff to the adipose tissue, just so much is coming in, what can happen is we can actually store lipids in tissues that are not meant to be lipid storehouses. So we start to store lipids in the liver, in the heart, in the pancreas, in the muscle tissue. Now we do store some lipids in the muscle tissue as intramyocellular lipids, and those are needed. They're important little organelles, but they get sort of overrun with intramyocellular lipids that are not functioning well when we're eating too much of this stuff. So lipotoxicity is very important. It can cause cell death or cell damage. It can even, as little as 1% of lipids in your pancreas can destroy beta cells. So this is really important. It can cause tissue inflammation. It can cause mitochondrial dysfunction, insulin resistance, and especially when you end up with this sort of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, you're storing these lipids in the liver, your liver makes your whole body insulin resistant when that happens. So even 30% at a level, 30% reduction in liver fat can reverse insulin resistance. It's really quite phenomenal. This is important, just important knowledge to have. It can cause elevated triglycerides. It can cause elevated blood glucose. So lipotoxicity is something that we just need to be aware of. What causes it? Overconsumption leading to overweight and obesity. Diets that are high in fat, especially saturated fat and trans fatty acids, and diets that are high in refined carbohydrates, particularly sugars, and fructose being even more damaging than glucose. And so one thing to understand is, as soon as I say fructose, people think fruit. But one thing to understand is that the liver has a capacity to be able to deal with the fructose in fruit efficiently. It's when you take fructose, concentrate it, and pour it into your sodas and into your processed foods and start eating it that way, that the liver becomes overwhelmed. It can't deal with that much fructose, because fructose isn't like glucose where your whole body can deal with it. The liver has to deal with it. And so it gets overwhelmed very, very, very quickly. So plant-based advantage here. Well, vegans actually have the lowest rates of overweight and obesity of all dietary patterns. They have lower levels of lipids in the muscle, the intramyocellular lipids, which are a marker of lipotoxicity when compared to matched omnivores. And they have the lowest intakes by far of saturated fat. So they're at an advantage. And finally, dysbiosis. Dysbiosis compromises the integrity of the gut barrier with numerous adverse health consequences. We get a decreased supply of essential nutrients, reduced immune function, increased inflammation and oxidative stress, and elevated risk of obesity and chronic disease. So what causes dysbiosis? Well, unhealthy Western-style diets, for sure. Antibiotics, medication, stress, and poor dental hygiene can all be contributors to dysbiosis. Is there a plant-based advantage? Well, and there are many studies that have looked at microflora in people eating different dietary patterns. So we're just going to look at a couple of studies from 2017, the most recent studies. The first study was that Brazil study where they actually looked at microflora as well as other indicators of health like CRP. The vegans had the most favorable microbiota, followed by the lacto-ovo-vegetarians. And in this study, the authors actually concluded that exposure to animal foods may favor an intestinal environment which could trigger systemic inflammation and insulin resistance. In the second study, this was a study from Italy, a smaller study, only 29 participants with just very small numbers, 10 vegans, 12 lacto-ovo-vegetarians, and 7 non-vegetarians. But in this study, the lacto-ovo-vegetarians and the vegans had the most favorable microbiota, but the people who were lacto-ovo-vegetarian actually had the most favorable of all, which is interesting, and it may be because they were consuming a lot of yogurt. I'm not sure. But both had reduced genotoxicity as well. So the bottom line is the most effective dietary patterns are dietary patterns that minimize pathogenic dietary components and maximize protective dietary components. When we look at the research and look at what components in the diet are actually associated with reduced risk of disease, there's certain components that come up over and over again, and they are fiber, phytochemicals, plant enzymes which are responsible for converting some of these phytochemicals into their bioactive metabolites or their active forms. Antioxidants, anti-inflammatory compounds, plant sterols and stanols, pre and probiotics, and then the micro and macronutrients that come mainly from whole plant foods. Those are, macro and micronutrients come from all foods, but the healthiest are from whole plant foods. So if we look at this list, what I really want you to notice is if you look at every single item here and think about where these dietary components actually come from. Well, first, fiber. Where does fiber come from? It comes from plants, only plants. Phytochemicals. Well, phyto means plants. It's chemicals in plants. Antioxidants, predominantly plants. Anti-inflammatory compounds, predominantly plants. Plant sterols and stanols, of course, plants. Pre and probiotics you can get from a variety of things, but it's the prebiotics are only plants. The probiotics are anything with the bacteria, fermented foods. So the bottom line is, and the World Health Organization said this, in 2011. They actually said it in 1999 even. But plant foods are where the protective components are concentrated. And if you look at the pathogenic factors in food, you see trans fatty acids and excessive saturated fat and refined carbohydrates and excessive sodium, new 5-GC, which is a pro-inflammatory molecule, chemical contaminants, all the products of high temperature cooking, pro-oxidants and TMAO, and you look at all of these things and think, well, where do these things come from? Well, they come from the two categories of foods that the World Health Organization pointed out in 2011. Processed foods with added fat, sugar, and salt, and animal products. Trans fatty acids, processed foods. Saturated fat, mainly animal products. Refined carbohydrates, processed foods. Excessive sodium, processed foods. New 5-GC is the pro-inflammatory molecule in meat. Chemical contaminants. We're looking at things that largely move up the food chain. And products of high temperature cooking. So a lot of them are concentrated animal products, but in other things as well. Pro-oxidants like heme iron, animal products, TMAO, animal products. TMAO is trimethylamine N-oxide, and it comes from carnitine and choline we mainly get by eating meat, and our bacteria in our colons change the choline or carnitine into TMA, and it gets shuttled to the liver, and it gets changed into TMAO, and it's very atherogenic, and it can increase the risk of kidney disease and so on. So again, two categories of foods that are most pathogenic. And so when you look at what people are actually consuming, 39% of our calories are coming from added fats, oils, and sugars. 30% from animal products. 22% from grains, 90 or 95% of which are refined. So refined carbohydrates. 9% from vegetables, fruits, and legumes. And probably half of that is orange juice and ketchup. So you look at that and you say, I understand why most of the people in this country are overweight or obese and dying of chronic, diet-induced diseases. Look at what we're eating. Most of what we eat is a threat to health. That's the bottom line. Fortunately, we have a choice. So I just want to introduce you to the Vallejo family. And this family, this is Andreas, and just to give you a little case study. He was diagnosed with cancer in, about, 6 years ago now. He was 36 years of age. It was cancer of the salivary gland. And he decided to adopt a plant-based diet after doing a ton of research to give himself the best chance of survival. And I think that, and he is in remission, by the way, but the most exciting part of this story is what happened to the rest of his family, because when he announced his vegan diet, his plant-based diet, the whole family said, whatever diet you're going on, we're going on with you. We just want to stand with you in this journey. And this was really quite remarkable, because this family was a foodie family. Their favorite pastime was going to the best restaurant in town and ordering the biggest steak and the $500 bottle of wine. So this was their favorite, it was the thing they did. So this was huge. But the story I want to tell you is what happened to Carlos. Because Carlos was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes in 1993. He had just had a serious heart attack. He had hypertension, high cholesterol, peripheral artery disease, early stage renal failure, recurring gout, and he was being treated on 17 pills a day and 40 units of insulin. He asked his doctor how long he could expect to live, and his doctor said, probably 2 years if you're lucky. And he was told that every one of these diseases was progressive and irreversible. There was nothing he could do to change the course of these diseases. But when he went on a whole food plant-based diet, after less than a year, Carlos was taking 0 insulin and 0 pills. His fasting glucose was absolutely normal, A1C normal, blood pressure 115/70. His arteries opened up without surgery. He had no peripheral artery disease, normal. His kidney function went back to normal. He had not one single further recurrence of gout. And 5 years later, 6 years later now maybe, his numbers have been maintained without any of the medications he was on. His heart disease reports, he had very severe coronary artery disease. His ejection fraction was 50% or reduced. And that was 2005. In 2017, no evidence of abnormal cardiac activity whatsoever, and he had a normal ejection fraction of 61%. This is, 12 years later. It's really quite astonishing. But this is what is possible. Not everyone is willing to make the necessary lifestyle changes, but everyone has a right to know that lifestyle changes are a safe and highly effective treatment option. That, to me, is the bottom line. We know enough. We know enough to protect people by developing policies that make healthy choices the easy choices for people. We know enough to make lifestyle medicine the first-line therapy for individuals with lifestyle-induced chronic diseases. So now we will move on to what to eat. How can we create a diet that provides maximum protection against chronic disease? So we'll look at the 10 steps to an optimal plant-based diet. And step 1 is to make whole plant foods the foundation of the diet. What I would suggest is 10 or more servings of vegetables and fruits each day with every color of the rainbow. 2 or more servings of legumes every day. Intact whole grains being the predominant whole grains you're eating, and you vary your intake to meet energy needs. Nuts and seeds, 1 or 2 servings a day, and generous amounts of herbs and spices. I think this needs to be a new food group because we're finding that there are so many protective phytochemicals and antioxidants in these foods. Step 2 is to select our carbohydrates with care. And, carbohydrates are not the enemy. Carbohydrates are consistently protective to human health when they come from whole plant foods. If you think about, you remember the list of protective foods and pathogenic, or protective factors and pathogenic factors, and we, it was all plant foods are the most protective. Just take a look at the carbohydrate content of plant foods. 92% of the calories from fruits are carbohydrates, 90% in starchy vegetables, 75% in grains, 70% in legumes, and 58% in what we call non-starchy vegetables. 58% of the calories are still coming from carbohydrates. If you look, these are the healthiest foods on the planet. They provide between 60 and 90% of calories from carbohydrates. How can carbohydrates be dangerous when you consider this simple fact? It wouldn't make sense. But the truth is, refined carbohydrates are bad news. And what the carbohydrate naysayers forget is that there's a big difference between carbohydrates that are packaged with fiber and phytochemicals and carbohydrates that have been stripped of everything of value to human health. So what are refined carbohydrates? Well, as I mentioned, they're carbohydrates that you take away the fiber, you take away the vitamins and minerals, and we do this by food processing. And so we've got these simple sugars and jams and syrups and sweet beverages, and we've got complex refined carbohydrates like white flour products and white rice and so forth. So 2 categories of refined carbohydrates. And if you think about sugars, well, what is recommended? Well, the American Heart Association says men should not consume more than 9 teaspoons a day, women not more than 6. The dietary guidelines for Americans say not more than 10% of calories. That's about 12 teaspoons in a 2,000 calorie diet. And the World Health Organization also says not more than 10 calories. However, they also add that less than 5% of calories would actually be better, which is about 6 teaspoons a day, would provide additional health benefits if people could limit sugar intake to that. In my view, added sugars, how much should we be eating? 0. We don't need them. We get plenty of sweet from fruits and dried fruits and just eating whole foods. We don't need to be adding sugar. But what a lot of people don't know is actual intakes are about 22 teaspoons a day. And if you look at the numbers, just a 20-ounce bottle of soda would be 18 to 21 teaspoons. Flavored coffee, you could get 7 to 18 teaspoons of sugar in one coffee. 1 cup of fruit yogurt, 9 to 12 teaspoons of sugar. A cinnamon bun, 12. An energy bar, 5. Even a 1/4 cup of barbecue sauce, 4. Instant oatmeal, 3.5. It just adds up very quickly when you look at the numbers. And if you look at the sources of added sugars as a percent of calories in the diet, almost half come from sweet beverages. If people did nothing else but stopped drinking sugar, they would make a huge dent in their health. Improved, they would have less overweight and obesity, and they would reduce inflammation and oxidative stress and so on. So that really is step number 1. We get about 31% from sweets and snacks. So again, we really need to look at what we're consuming. And then if we look at the complex carbohydrates that are refined, many people are claiming that grains are harmful to health. We see grain brain, wheat belly, and all of the paleo folks saying, do not eat grains, but are grains really helpful? Well, the answer is, I'm going to sound like a bit of a broken record, but only if they are refined. And that's really the bottom line. The problem is 90% plus of the grains Americans consume are refined. And so when people are saying carbs are bad, they're talking about refined carbs that make up 90% of the grains people are eating. On the other hand, and when you think about it, when we refine grains, we take a whole grain that has 3 parts. You probably know this, but the bran, the endosperm, the germ, and we remove 2 of the 3 parts. We remove the bran and the germ, where the fiber and the nutrients are concentrated, and we're left with the endosperm, which is really the carbohydrates, a little bit of protein, a few nutrients, but not a whole lot. In the process of turning a whole grain into, say, white flour, we remove 80 to 90% of the fiber, 70 to 80% of the vitamins and minerals, and about 95% of the protective phytochemicals. And then who eats a bowl of white flour? Nobody. Nobody eats a bowl of white flour. What do you do before you eat the bowl of white flour? You add fat, sugar, salt, color, preservatives, flavors, and then you eat the white flour, right? And that's the problem. Not only are you removing most of what's of value to human health, you're adding a bunch of junk to it before you actually eat it that's harmful to human health. So therein lies the problem. The evidence, we've got a 2016 meta-analysis of 45 studies that reported that whole grain intake is associated with a reduced risk of mortality from all causes, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancer, and respiratory diseases. So this is what we know. All whole grains, however, are not created equal. So a granola bar does not equal a bowl of oatmeal. And a box of kamut flakes, even if they're organic, does not equal a kamut berry salad. Okay, and so we need to understand there are differences even within the world of whole grains. There's differences because of the level of processing of those whole grains. And so I've created this thing called the whole grain hierarchy. And the whole grain hierarchy is the top of the hierarchy are intact whole grains. And when I say intact whole grains, what am I talking about? I'm talking about the grains as they're picked off the plant. Nothing added, nothing taken away. Oat groats, kamut berries, quinoa, barley. That's what we're talking about. And even better than cooking those intact whole grains would be sprouting them. Because when you sprout them, you decrease anti-nutrients and you increase a wide variety of nutrients and you increase phytochemicals in that food by probably about 500%. So some interesting changes. The next on the list would be cut whole grains. So all we do is chop the whole grains. We're increasing the surface area, we're increasing exposure to oxygen, so we could get some oxidation happening. So one level down. And we're talking about things like steel-cut oats. Then the rolled whole grains, then the shredded whole grains, then ground whole grains or whole wheat flour products, then flaked whole grains, and then at the bottom of the barrel is puffed whole grains. So why are we going down on this list? Because as we go down, we actually increase glycemic index, so the rate at which these foods are absorbed into the bloodstream and impact our blood sugar and insulin resistance and so forth. But we're also increasing destruction of nutrients as we go down. So we get fewer nutrients, we get higher glycemic index. And so not that you can't have some of these things down lower on the list, especially people who use a lot of calories. But for people who have disease and are trying to reverse disease, I urge them to draw the line at the rolled whole grains and eat only the grains above the line. And if they want really rapid results, just draw the line at intact whole grains and eat nothing else. So that's just one of the ways that I've found in my work, especially with diabetes and in the Marshall Islands, that we see much more dramatic results more quickly, is sticking more to intact whole grains. So carbohydrate common sense, we want to get our carbohydrates from vegetables, fruits, legumes, and whole grains. We want to avoid all beverages with added sugars, and we want to minimize refined carbohydrates, sugars and starches, and other highly processed grains. Step 3 is to boost fiber. And we know fiber is nature's broom. It keeps our intestinal tract clean. It promotes regularity, improves gut flora. It increases satiety and reduces cravings, reduces cholesterol, stabilizes blood sugar, reduces our risk of GI disorders, colorectal cancer, and it enhances immune function, and it also can help to lessen hormonal imbalances. So if we think about how much should we consume, how much people are actually consuming. Well, the RDA is 38 grams a day for men and 25 for women, and it's based on about 14 grams per 1,000 calories of food intake. Actual intake is about 15 to 17 grams a day in the American diet. The vegan diet, about 35 to 40 grams a day for women and about 45 to 60 for men. And it's not too much different on a raw food diet. Now this is the shocker, and I'm going to be doing a presentation, I think it's on Monday, on Paleolithic diets, you know, the new paleo diet versus real Paleolithic diets. And fiber intakes in the Paleolithic times were estimated to be between 70 and 150 plus grams a day. Just so you know, this is what humans consumed for millennia, was far more fiber than even vegans consume. So that one's hard to wrap your brain around, but we'll be talking about that in the next lecture, in my next lecture. So we want to be aiming for at least 12 to 20 grams of fiber per meal, but we don't want to just be sprinkling wheat bran on food. We want to be getting fiber from a variety of whole plant foods. And if you look at what are the most concentrated sources of fiber, well, beans are at the top of the list, then avocado, then grains, berries, and then other fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds. The thing to know is only plant foods contain fiber. All whole plant foods contain fiber. And refined carbohydrates, fast foods, processed foods are low fiber foods. And the no fiber foods, of course, are meat, poultry, fish, dairy, eggs, oils, and sugars. 0 fiber. Step 4 is to pick plant protein sources. So when we compare, you know, plant protein sources versus meat, some things come up. So first of all, legumes are the highest fiber food. Meat has no fiber. Legumes are high in phytochemicals. Meat has 0. Legumes are high in antioxidants. Meat has minimal antioxidants. Legumes are very low in fat generally, and very low in saturated fat. Meat's high in fat and high in saturated fat. Legumes, of course, are cholesterol-free. Meat is fairly high in cholesterol. Legumes contain a type of iron called non-heme iron, which is absorbed much more slowly into the system and it isn't a pro-oxidant, whereas meat has heme iron, which is absorbed very rapidly, even if we don't need it, and when we get excessive amounts, can act as a pro-oxidant. Legumes don't contain hormones or antibiotics. Meat can. Legumes are free of new 5-GC. Of course, meat contains it. You can't produce TMAO by eating legumes. You certainly can by eating meat. Legumes are generally fairly low in chemical contaminants. Meat is high. Legumes don't contain any endotoxins. Meat contains tons. This is the stuff that comes from the dead bacteria in meat, and when it breaks down, you end up with these endotoxins. And then legumes, if you look at legumes and mortality, we saw in the blue zones, that was the one food they all consumed. But there was a study done that actually looked at food intake patterns of people 70 years of age or more from a variety of cultures. The only statistically significant food indicator of longevity was legumes, or legume intake. For every 20 grams or 2/3 of an ounce, what is that? Maybe a tablespoon and a half, a very small amount of legumes, there was a 7 to 8% reduction in mortality. This is really quite shocking. Imagine if people ate a whole cup. They would live forever. And it's just, you know, it's really, this for me was a very powerful study. Now, if you look at the studies on red meat and mortality, well, they're just absolutely consistent. This is the most recent 5 meta-analyses. Total red meat is the sort of dark line, the unprocessed, the bright red, and processed, the pink. And you can see that consumption of both red meat and processed meat is associated with increased mortality in every single one of these studies. It's consistent. And then people always ask the question, can we get enough protein from plants? And I don't know anybody that becomes a vegetarian, it's the first question they get asked. Where do you get your protein? And I love this cartoon by Dan Pizarro. It says, it's this little rodent here asking this huge muscular gorilla, no meat at all? Are you sure you're getting enough protein? And the point being here that the largest, strongest, most muscular land mammals on the planet are vegetarians. They're, elephants and giraffes and hippopotamuses and these huge gorillas, and they manage to build these huge muscles without eating any meat. And probably people can too. And we look at some of the vegan athletes. Just go to veganbodybuilding.com. It's unbelievable. You see these huge muscles that are, completely 100% vegan. And it just makes sense. And so how much protein do we actually need? Well, the RDA for adults is about 46 grams a day for women, about 56 for men, or about 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight. Children need more, athletes, and possibly seniors may need as much as 25% more. In Australia, the recommendations for people 70 plus are 25% higher than they are for younger adults. Why? Because the digestibility is reduced as we get older. We're not able to absorb as many of the amino acids we need. So, and people that are eating whole food plant-based diet, because of the fiber and the reduced digestibility of whole plant foods slightly, we increase about recommended protein intakes by about 10%. So that would, bring us up to about 50 grams for women and about 60 grams or so for men, or a little bit more than that. It's still not a lot, especially when you look at how much protein is in foods. So you look at, soybeans, tofu, so the soy foods or the veggie meats, you're getting about 15 to 30 grams of protein per serving. That's about the same as you get from a serving of meat. From lentils and other legumes, you get about 14 to 18 grams of protein per cup. From hemp seeds, pumpkin seeds, kamut, spelt, wheat, amaranth, quinoa, you get about 8 to 13 grams of protein per serving, or per cup of cooked grains, a quarter cup of seeds. And that's about the same as you get from 2 eggs or a cup of milk or an ounce of cheese. It's not much different. And then you get some from pretty much every other plant food you're eating as well. But then people say, but even if you can get enough protein, isn't plant protein inferior to animal protein? And the answer is this: no. All essential amino acids, or what we call indispensable amino acids, are actually made by plants. It makes no sense to think we can't get them from plants. It's where they come from. Animals have all of these amino acids in their muscle tissue. They got it at some point along the food chain from plants. It's where they come from. So we can get plenty of essential amino acids from plants, providing we consume a variety of plant foods over the course of the day, including some protein-rich choices like legumes and seeds and so forth, and sufficient calories are eaten. And for most people, getting sufficient calories is not a huge problem. Step 5 is to fine-tune our fat. So we want to limit quantity to some extent and really focus on quality. We want to limit saturated fat. The dietary guidelines for Americans say less than 10% of calories, but the American Heart Association, the American College of Cardiology guidelines for cardiovascular disease risk reduction are 5 to 6% of calories. And do you know the percent of Americans that get less than 7% of calories from saturated fat? About 5%. And guess what the average vegan gets? About 4 to 7%. How many vegans are there in America? About 5% of the population. So it's the vegans who are actually on target, period. And 5 to 6% of calories means less than 16 grams on a 2,000 calorie diet. So less than 16 grams. Well, you get, 22 from a couple slices of Meat Lover's pizza. You get 18 from a double cheeseburger, 15 from a 6-ounce steak, 9 from just 1 ounce of cheese, 8 from a cup of milk. And you compare that to the amounts of saturated fat in plant foods. The only one that's high at all is really coconut, at an ounce of coconut at 7 grams. But look at a half an avocado or an ounce of nuts or seeds. We're looking at somewhere between, half a gram and 2 grams for most of these foods. We want to avoid trans fatty acids. And in 2005, the FDA set a 3-year time limit for the removal of trans fats in processed foods. We're there. It's 2018. It's been 3 years. So this won't be much of a problem, I think, in fairly short order, although 10% of trans does come from animal products, as you probably know. Next, we want to minimize exposure to damaged fats. So we want to avoid fried foods completely. Just do not fry foods in fat. It's not a good plan. We want to minimize or avoid oils in cooking. We don't want to expose oils to high temperature, and especially if the oil starts to smoke, then we're producing products of oxidation that are pretty toxic to human health. We don't want to burn high-fat foods or allow them to blacken. And we want to store high-fat foods, including shelled nuts and seeds, in the refrigerator or freezer. This is really important, and a lot of people don't know this. They have all sorts of mason jars of different nuts and seeds on their shelf. Well, nuts and seeds, you see, nature has a way of protecting the fragile fats in these foods, and that's with a shell. When you remove that shell, you're exposing that nut or seed to oxidation. And so over time, you'll get more and more oxidized fats. Keep them in the freezer or refrigerator to prevent that from happening. And you want to minimize processed foods, of course, as well. And then, of course, you want to make whole plant foods your primary sources of fat. High-fat whole plant foods are rich in fiber and antioxidants and phytochemicals and plant sterols and stanols and all of these protective components. But we want to minimize concentrated fats and oils because they provide a lot of calories with very few nutrients. I often say that, oils are to the fat family as sugars are to the carbohydrate family, sugars and white flour. They're highly processed. The fiber and many of the nutrients have been removed. Neither is poison. It's, the dose that makes the poison in very small quantities, a couple of drops of sesame oil to give that kind of flavor in a peanut sauce, no big deal. But it's when you're using massive amounts, pouring it on your salads, using it in your cooking in large quantity, not such a good plan. Instead, use nuts and seeds as bases, or nut and seed butters or avocados as your bases in salad dressings, because then you get the fiber and all of the nutrients that go with those foods. We want to ensure sufficient omega-3 fatty acids. And for most people eating plant-based diets, we're looking at about 2 to 4 grams of alpha-linolenic acid a day. And so how do we get this? Well, an ounce of walnuts gives us 2.6. A tablespoon of ground flax seeds is 2.6. And if we grind them, it'll be a little more of a heaping tablespoon. But we're looking at we want to grind them because these flax seeds are slippery little things, and they go right through us. So if you grind them, you make that omega-3 more available for absorption. Chia seeds, about 1.7 in a tablespoon. Hemp seeds, about 0.9. And leafy greens, half the fat in leafy greens or more is omega-3. But they're so low in fat, you'd have to eat a truckload. You'd have to eat like a horse or a cow to get enough. You need about 30 cups, 20 or 30 cups, right? So, and some people, eat like that, but not very many because you're eating all day long or you're juicing a lot. But so you can get some from leafy greens, but you usually need some nuts or seeds to balance it out. So the next question where omega-3s is concerned is, don't we need fish for EPA and DHA? And the answer is no. Actually, EPA and DHA are made by microalgae, plants from the sea. And so, yes, you can consume fish, which got it, at some point along the food chain from the microalgae, or you can cut out the fish and just eat the microalgae. You can actually culture it. You don't have to rape the ocean to get it. It can be cultured, grown, and you can take it as a supplement, or sometimes it's added to foods. And so that works very well. So do we need to take DHA and EPA? The answer is we don't really know. Vegans do very well in terms of chronic disease, in terms of brain function, in terms of risk of, brain disorders. We do very well. Would we do better if we took DHA and EPA? Vegans have levels of EPA and DHA that are significantly lower than omnivores, probably about 1/3 1/3 that of omnivore, 1/3 in some cases, 1/2, but definitely significantly lower levels. And so if our levels were boosted, would it give us an even bigger advantage is the question. And we don't know. The research just isn't there yet. But we do know that EPA and DHA have been associated with some health benefits. So to me, it makes sense for people that have increased needs for EPA and DHA, like pregnant and breastfeeding women, to consider taking a supplement. However, young women are the most efficient converters of of ALA to EPA and DHA. So alpha-linolenic acid, the plant omega-3, can be converted into these bigger, more unsaturated, larger omega-3 fatty acids that are more biologically active. The body can do that, but the ability to do that is somewhat limited. But it's highest in young women because they need to be able to convert for the brain growth of their infants and so on. But still, they may want to consider. And there are people that don't convert plant omega-3s to long-chain omega-3s very efficiently. People with diabetes, metabolic syndrome, or hypertension are poor converters. Populations who have traditionally consumed a lot of fish are poor converters. And this is because the enzymes required for conversion, they just stop making as many because they don't need them. They're consuming preformed EPA and DHA. So if you don't need to be converting that enzyme, we don't make as much of it. And so if that's been happening for many generations, they may need to have a direct source. So microalgae supplements, there are a lot of supplements now available, and suggested intakes are 200 to 300 milligrams a day, or even just taking it 2 to 3 times a week to boost your sort of levels. Step 6 is to enhance gut flora. There are many benefits to healthy gut flora, and I'm just going to zip through them. One of them is enhanced nutritional status, because gut flora actually produces nutrients, can protect against pathogens, promote healthy body weight. You can actually get some energy in short-chain fatty acids that protect against colon cancer from your gut flora. You get better immunity, reduced inflammation. You get better maintenance of the integrity of the sort of lining of the intestinal wall. You get better brain function. You get increased insulin secretion when you have a healthy gut flora. So how do we improve gut flora? Well, we want to eat a diet high in prebiotics from beans, whole grains, asparagus, Jerusalem artichokes, bananas, onions, and garlic. These are especially high in prebiotics. We want to eat food-based probiotics, like, I would suggest non-dairy yogurts, fermented vegetables, sauerkraut, tempeh, miso. These are all foods with the probiotics in them. And prebiotics, for those of you that don't know, prebiotics are the food for the bacteria. Probiotics are the bacteria, just to get to understand that. And then we want to minimize intake of foods that foster the growth of bad bacteria or harmful bacteria. Processed foods, fried foods, refined carbohydrates, and meat. We want to take probiotics, especially if we're using antibiotics, and avoid excessive alcohol consumption. Step 7 is to maximize antioxidants and phytochemicals. And phytochemicals are really just chemicals that plant makes to protect themselves. So it enhances their survival. It's their chemical defense system. Many phytochemicals are also protective to people. They reduce inflammation, they block tumor formation, they can kill cancer cells, they stimulate enzymes, destroy pathogens, reduce blood pressure, improve endothelial function. They just do. The list is really pages and pages long. They do a lot of things that will potentially protect against disease. And then antioxidants are compounds that help to protect against oxidative stress and disease processes. And so how do we enhance phytochemicals and antioxidants? Well, think color. The richest sources of phytochemicals and antioxidants are often the most colorful. To maximize protection, we might want to choose the colorful vegetables rather than the less colorful choices. Black instead of brown rice, or red instead of brown rice, red instead of white beans, for example. So these are just some, even quinoa, you can get red or black versus white. You tend to get more phytochemicals when you choose the color. And also variety. The wider the range of plant foods in the diet, the wider the range of antioxidants and phytochemicals you will be consuming. We want to eat more raw foods, and the reason for this is that there are enzymes in raw foods that when we cook those foods, we destroy the enzymes that convert the phytochemicals into their active forms. So, for example, myrosinase helps convert a compound called glucosinolates into the more active form called isothiocyanates, like sulforaphane, which is a very potent detoxifier of carcinogens. So it's very, very important. And then we've got allanase, and myrosinase is in cruciferous vegetables, and allanase is in allium vegetables, and it helps convert allan to the active form allicin. And then the other thing we can do is to start sprouting. And when a seed is germinated, anti-nutrients are broken down, enzymes are released so that the stored forms of nutrients can be available for the plant growth. And the phytochemical army that's poised to protect the plant just multiplies. And so these are really helpful things as well. Step 8 is to reduce harmful chemical residues and food additives. And so we're talking here about agrochemicals, environmental contaminants, products of food processing and cooking, and food additives. And when we consume these things, they can wreak havoc in a number of ways. They can cause oxidative stress and inflammation. They can disrupt hormones and be, if you will, obesogens, increase obesity. They can damage vital organs, damage DNA in our central nervous systems, and they can increase the risk of chronic disease. So agrochemicals, pesticides, plant growth regulators, veterinary drugs like hormones and antibiotics and antimicrobials. And the way to avoid these things is to choose organic. And so this is, it's a simple way. Not everybody can afford to do everything organic. But one thing that you can do is go to the environmental working groups, Dirty Dozen and Clean 15. And if you have to buy some conventional, stick with the cleaner crops and buy the sort of the Dirty Dozen, buy organic at least. Environmental contaminants like heavy metals and persistent organic pollutants, or POPs, like PCBs, DDT, and dioxin. Packaging materials like lead and BPA and tin. And the most concentrated sources of heavy metals and POPs are animal products, fish, meat, and dairy products. And so what do? Eat lower on the food chain. Eat more plants, eat fewer animals, and use foods without excessive packaging. Jars instead of cans, and BPA-free lining in cans. The products of high temperature cooking, heterocyclic amines are known carcinogens. They're formed only when we cook meat at high temperatures. Meat, poultry, fish at high temperatures. Plants can't form heterocyclic amines because you need to have creatine or creatinine in the food to make heterocyclic amines. Plants don't have any, so we don't have to worry about that. Polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons are a second product of cooking. These are known mutagens. They're linked with a number of cancers, and they're present in grilled or charred meat, poultry, and fish, but also in any plant food that's grilled and blackened. How we can avoid this is by avoid blackening foods and avoid heating foods above 392 degrees, or Fahrenheit, or 200 degrees centigrade. Advanced glycation end products, these are basically compounds that are advanced products of the Maillard reaction. And they're irreversible products of the Maillard reaction, and they impair immune function. They accelerate aging. They contribute to pretty much every disease you can think of, including Alzheimer's disease. And what you see is they're highest in bacon, broiled frankfurters, grilled or fried meat, but even whipped butter, even fried tofu, Parmesan cheese, even roasted nuts. So you can see they accumulate probably more in animal products than plants, but can form in plant foods as well. Oh, and I'm trying to remember, they'll form at any temperature. Acrylamide is a substance that's formed from starchy foods, and the main component that forms acrylamide is something called agarotine, which is, no, not agarotine, it's, it's asparagine. Sorry, I'm mixing up the chemical in mushrooms with asparagine. But asparagine is the amino acid that you need to form acrylamide, and it's mostly found in potatoes, both sweet potatoes and regular potatoes. And so just to know, if you're heating them above 248 degrees, which you always do when you bake, you're forming some of these compounds, but they're formed most when you deep fry. So potato chips and French fries are the worst. And I'm just going to whip down this. So how do we avoid this? We'll use food preparation methods that minimize the production of harmful compounds, so wet cooking methods instead of dry cooking methods. And if you're using dry, keep heat lower. And then finally, harmful food additives. You just want to avoid artificial sweeteners, all the, you can read labels, but preferably use fewer foods with labels. We want to be using whole foods. The most common food additive is salt, and 80% comes from processed foods. And if you look at the amount of salt in foods, like a teaspoon of salt is 2,300 milligrams of sodium. You can go down this list: ramen, dill pickles, soup, tomato sauce, veggie burger, raisin bran, Italian dressing, potato chips, salted peanuts. You can actually eat an ounce of potato chips and an ounce of salted peanuts and get less sodium than you would from an ounce of raisin bran. And people go, no way, that's impossible. But when you put salt on the outside of a potato chip or a peanut, you taste it. It's just there. Whereas you put it inside batter and you make something like flake cereal, and it's throughout the batter, you don't taste it in the same way. So you need to read labels. Step 9 is to meet nutrients, meet your needs for all the nutrients of concern. And in plant-based diet, the biggest nutrients of concern are B12 and vitamin D. And we're not going to talk a lot about these, but just know they need to be taken care of. And one of the things that I've done in my career as a dietitian is to create resources that help people to do vegetarian and vegan diets very well. Because to me, a failed vegan is really exhibit number 1 for why we need to eat meat. And so it's really important we get this right. And so the resources that I've written and created, and the food guides and so on, are meant to be essentially foolproof. You'll get this right if you follow these guidelines. And I mentioned that. And step 10 is to maintain a healthy body weight. So one thing that I think the blue zones, especially Okinawans, have done really well is something called Heri Hachibu. They eat until they're 80% full instead of stuffing themselves. So they're under-eating a little bit all the time, and this is helpful. We want to minimize foods with added fat, sugar, and salt. Fat, sugar, and salt, in nature, these flavors are so dilute. When you take and concentrate those flavors in processed foods, it messes up your appetite control center and you can't stop eating them. And so this is something we just really need to be aware of. We need to say, these foods I'm just not going to do because I need to reacquaint my appetite control system with whole, unadulterated foods. It makes a huge difference. We need to avoid supersizing, except for salad. We can supersize our salads. And drink water, not sugar. Just do not ever drink sugar, period. That's an important step. And there's no question that well-designed whole food plant-based diets are optimal for human health. But a diet is really only optimal if it is ecologically sustainable and ethically justifiable. We have got to, as human beings who are populating this planet at almost 8 billion people now, We have got to consider the consequences of our food choices beyond ourselves. There is no diet that any one individual human being can consume that will reduce our carbon footprint more or help us to preserve the planet more than a plant-based diet. And we know that. The United Nations Environmental Program, their expert panel concluded that 2 activities have a disproportionately large effect on the planet's life support systems. And they are animal agriculture, especially raising livestock for meat and dairy, and the use of fossil fuels. And the United Nations Environmental Program expert panel's recommendation, a global shift towards a plant-based diet. The National Academy of Sciences in 2016, the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences reported the following, that by 2050, greenhouse gas emissions would be reduced by 29% compared to doing what we're doing now, if everybody on the planet followed the global dietary guidelines to eat more fruits and vegetables, less meat, sugar, and calories. And 70% if everyone consumed a vegan diet. The author's recommendation, a global shift towards a plant-based diet. And of course, in order to be truly optimal, our diet has got to also be ethically justifiable. For people, if everyone ate plant-based, the global calorie supply would increase by an estimated 50%. And according to this report in Scientific American, it could effectively wipe out hunger. And for animals. For people, we care deeply about the people that are starving to death. But if you take a look at what's going on with animals today, we are slaughtering 70 billion. That's almost 10 times the human population. We're slaughtering 70 billion sentient beings every year for food. And this is not including anything from the oceans. This is just land animals. The vast majority, probably close to 90%, are raised in CAFOs. CAFOs are concentrated animal feeding operations. And these, if you know nothing about CAFOs, just educate yourself. Because, I don't think there's anything that we as human beings can do to justify what we're doing to these creatures. Dr. Albert Schweitzer gave us some food for thought when he said the following: "The time is coming when people will be amazed that the human race existed so long before it recognized that thoughtless injury to life is incompatible with real ethics. Ethics in its unqualified form is extended responsibility to everything that has life." And I guess we could simplify this by saying, why should we be contributing to pain, suffering, and death when it is completely unnecessary? Not only is it unnecessary, we're harming the earth and we're harming ourselves when we do so. We need to think about this. We have a choice. When we consider the consequences of our food choices, not just for ourselves, but beyond ourselves, a plant-based diet becomes an ecological and an ethical imperative. And as human beings on this planet, we have a responsibility to take action and to do what we can to change our trajectory. We are destroying the planet for future generations, and it has got to stop, and it's got to stop now. And I know sometimes it's scary, but it's a hell of a lot scarier to think about what we're facing if we don't stand up and be counted. And so I will say thank you very much for being here and for attending. And these are some of my books. And thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I will be here I leave on the 6th, and I'm very happy to meet you, to learn from you, to share with you. And so please don't hesitate to ask questions or if you have information that might be of value, please share. Thank you.